All right, so this one was one that I think a lot of people had already been theorizing. We pretty much knew we were going to get a Metatron Jeanne. And the devs have finally given us this with Ordeal Call 4. It had been something that kind of leading up, there'd been a lot of hints dropped, and it was like, oh my god, like, we know that Ordeal Call 4 is going to deal with Metatron, and then it's like, oh my god, we see Jeanne in the trailer, and she's got glowing eyes, and it's like, yeah, I think putting one and one together was pretty obvious. I still haven't obviously done the story. I don't know anything about it. We're going to keep this review pretty much spoiler free, so I don't know anything about the circumstances of it. I'm just going to keep calling her JeanneTron because I feel like that's the best example and use of her name that I can think of that will flow well for everybody. So Tron, as I will shorten it to some of the time here, is definitely an interesting unit. She's an AoE buster ruler. Now, we already have Amakusa. We already have Ruler Artoria. So you would maybe think like, hey, you know, they wouldn't have maybe gone this route. Both of those two other rulers definitely have stuff in their kit that helps differentiate them. And you would think they would maybe try to avoid that, maybe make JeanneTron a single target. And they didn't do that. Instead, they really just kind of fixated on her overarching, like, kit and trying to make that the way that she stands out. So they did pretty much just level that playing field amongst the trinity of three buster AoE rulers now. The interesting part about this is that JeanneTron at least has some interesting stuff in her kit to really help her stand out. I've seen very mixed opinions on her today as she's come. And it's been like, oh, some people are feeling like she's really good. Other people are feeling like she's not good and that they should best ignore them. I'm going to say the answer is somewhere in the middle. That is to say, JeanneTron's not going to be anything like super amazing that you have to have. But if people are calling her bad, they're totally missing the forest for the trees, because there's actually some stuff here that they probably should be paying attention to rather than just writing her off. So let's go ahead and let's dive right in and let's take a look at JeanneTron's kit. So to start out with, she actually has a fairly high attack stat for a ruler. We've seen a lot of the rulers really down in the like 10k and low 11k range. So the fact that she's coming in here with about 12k is not bad. This does make her at least hit a little bit harder outside of her, you know, like conventional steroids and stuff like that. She's just always going to have a little bit more consistent carding capability. The trade-off here is going to be that her HP value is only going to be about 13, almost 14k. This is, at least compared to some of her other competition, a little bit lower. Rulers are usually a much more defensive unit rather than offensive, and it definitely helps them out in challenge content to have that sort of tank ability, because it allows them to weather a whole lot of hits. I'm going to say the real issue here, though, is not going to be HP. You're really not going to care too much about this. She's actually going to have quite the capability of taking care of herself. So the issue actually will be damage still in the end. She is a Sky Attribute Serpent. She has 104 star absorption, a little bit higher than the class average, 9.7 star generation rate, and 0.53 NP charge attack rate. This is all fairly standard. She has 3% NP charge defense, a death rate of 17.5, which is a little bit under the overall average for all units. And then alignment for her is going to be lawful and good. She's female gendered, and her basic traits are Shocking Nobody, the Saber Face trait, the Divine Spirit, the Divinity, and the Goddess Servant. That one's maybe a little bit more out there that people wouldn't have expected. She's also a humanoid, immune to Pigify, levitating, and non-hominidae servant, as well as just a normal servant, a super large servant, and weak to Enema Elish. Super large is another one that they kind of snuck in here, and you can actually see it with her attacks in her third form, as she does actually grow to a like giant status and try to crush people. I'm sure it's someone's fetish at Single at this point. So regardless, she does at least have an interesting deck. She is a buster-centric unit, but she's only got the 2 buster cards instead of being a sort of gorilla deck, as we like to call them, a triple buster deck. So the 2 buster cards with 2 arts cards and 1 quick card is going to be her layout, but the hit counts are all stellar. The only average hit count is actually her extra attack. Everything else here is above average. So that makes, especially for like the arts card, the NP gain rate of 0.53, it's actually really good with a 4-hit arts card. So definitely an interesting thing to see there nonetheless. Moving on to her skills, you can actually see that her first active skill here is going to increase her own buff removal resistance for 3 turns. Scales up to 100%. It is not limited in any way, so there's no like, oh, it only works for 1 time, or oh, it's only 1 turn. It's just everything for 3 turns. Nothing can remove her stuff. That's really good. I actually really like that. The only obvious caveat here is it's not party wide. They could have made JonTron a little bit more supportive, and I think that would have helped her out in some people's eyes. And I've definitely seen some interesting takes on this that I'll talk about here in a second. So the next effect here is that it's going to grant herself debuff immunity for 3 times 3 turns. That does have a limitation to it, but 3 times 3 turns is still pretty good. It's quite a bit of coverage there. And we're also going to get the self-evasion for 3 attacks, 3 turns. Obviously would prefer 3 turns, but they're not going to give us that, so they're just going to limit it to 3 attacks. Still really solid. It's basically a protection from arrows at that point. Really good. And then the last effect here is the 50% charge that she's going to get. Now, I did see some people say it would have been really cool if they actually made this a targetable charge. And I kind of agree. That would have actually given her a little bit more flexibility in support usage. But with this being one of the only real ways that she can actually gain NP, it's probably better for her to actually just go ahead and use this on herself 90% of the time anyways. So given the fact that this is not a targetable skill, it's just always going to be on her, I think it's fine that they did this, but that could have been an opportunity for them to maybe do a little bit more with the character and make them a little bit more versatile. The interesting part about the skill is going to be that it's on a 7-turn cooldown, and that you're not going to care about that, because you have 2 different ways of dealing with it. Obviously, the 5th append is one of them, but there's going to be another way right here as we move on to the second skill. That's right, JonTron actually has party-wide skill cooldown reduction. She's the first unit in the entire game to have a party-wide skill cooldown reduction. The only other party-wide cooldown reduction is going to come from a Noble Phantasm. That's going to be from OG Tamamo Caster. You're not going to get it any other way. So that is, I think, going to be her real, true big niche that she actually has. Obviously, she does have niche damage on her NP, but this party-wide cooldown reduction means that not only can she use this to benefit herself, like reducing the cooldown on her charge skill so that you can do it twice in a double Korean Skya comp, but also it's going to allow you to cool down everybody else in the party. So this could work for multiple damage dealer applications where you maybe have her handling a wave and then kind of reducing some other units' cooldowns as getting all the Korean Skya buffs and stuff like that. That could really work for them. And then maybe they can double up if they had, you know, like let's say it's like an Arcuid that has a 7-turn cooldown or something. Maybe you don't have the 5th append, but you do have this. This sort of alleviates the need to maybe have a 5th append in some circumstances, or maybe be able to like double up something even faster. So I do think this is really solid. But it doesn't stop there. You also have challenge applications for something like this, given that you can take her in as a ruler. She's definitely going to be tanky. Not only is she going to basically get a reduction to most units trying to hit her in terms of their damage output, but she's also got that, you know, first skill with all the evasion on it. And then this here as well. So she'll be really tanky, really survivable, but also able to reduce not just herself, but all of her allies' cooldowns. So that means getting back to things like, say, Merlin's invuln skill can come back faster, or again, maybe you're just trying to reset the cooldowns on other units' charge skills, you name it, it doesn't really matter. The idea behind this is simply that getting cooldown reduction in a challenge environment means you're getting back to skills faster and able to utilize them more effectively and quicker to be able to burst the enemy boss to death. So I think this skill actually has a whole lot of versatility, and I think we'll see over time as you'll see her get used and fit into certain comps either as the main contributing factor or as a sort of side piece character that can do a little bit of work but help out the other unit. From here, she's also going to gain critical stars every single turn for 3 turns, up to 15. And then also just have a crit star bomb up front of 15. So a little bit of a similar effect to, like, say, Scotty's third skill, where she also has the crit star bomb up front and then the stars per turn. I do think that this is a really, really interesting thing and also has some supportive capability in it. And then her third skill here is going to be an increase to her own attack for 3 turns of 30%. This is her only baked in steroid in her kit, and it is definitely something that I've seen people talk about. The thing about this is, well, yes, it's 30%, it's still pretty robust on its own, but with this being the only thing, is this a problem? And the answer is, her damage certainly could be better, but she does have niche damage on top of it. And the thing to keep in mind is a unit with very little steroids in their kit usually scales much better with additional steroids coming from supports than a unit without, or a unit rather that has steroids in their kit already. So if we say we're to compare a unit like Iskandar that has Buster up, attack up, and NP damage up, it has all 3 types of buffs there and really has some really good firepower synergy because everything's multiplicative within his own kit. That's really good, but adding additional sources of buffs to Iskandar is not necessarily going to make him hit as hard as adding additional sources of buffs to a different unit that maybe didn't have all of those skills. So that's the idea behind it, is that with her only having 1 steroid, yes, it could certainly be better, but it does mean that she'll scale better if you manage to give her more to help her out. She'll also increase her own critical damage for 3 turns by 50%. Nothing too crazy here, just a really nice crit buff. And again, with, you know, obviously Koyanskayas and Oberons and Merlins and stuff abound as your supports for a Buster comp. Crit damage already is really, really good for Buster, so her getting even more is just going to help her out even more. And then the icing on the cake here, she actually does have Invuln Pierce for 3 turns when you use the skill. The skill is on a 6-turn cooldown as well, so you can really get back to this if you want. And I actually didn't mention it before, but the second skill also has an 8-turn cooldown. When you use this skill, it will go down to 7. If you have the 5th append, it will go down to 6. So you could feasibly be able to double pop even the cooldown reduction in a composition as long as you're using double Koyanskaya on her. Okay, so that's it for her skills. Taking a look at the passives now, she actually has some pretty interesting and unique ones. So her first one is going to be a independent action variant. She's going to get critical damage up of 12%, but also damage cut of 200. Her next one here is going to be stars per turn, but not just that. She's going to get 5 critical stars for every turn, but also 5% NP gauge every turn. So another thing that, like, hey, if you're just using her for a conventional farming setup, this really isn't going to help too much. But if you're using it in a challenge environment, this is going to stack up quite a bit over time. Still, even in a farming setup, as long as you gave her 2 turns of wind up, that 5% per turn can turn into 10%. So you could manage to make do with it as long as you used her on the 3rd turn or something like that. Her third passive here is a unique form of divinity, which is just going to give some additional flat damage added of 225, but also 8% more NP damage on top of that. So she has a little bit of a spicy extra one there. That NP damage is also going to get scaled up by Oberon's 3rd skill if you want to. And then we basically have a 4th, I'm just going to not say the name at this point of this one, passive that increases her own mental debuff resistance by a whopping 30%. However, it will have a 500% chance to reduce her own sleep resistance by 50% as a demerit. So she's trading it for all of her mental debuffs, get 30% resistance, but the sleep one is going to have a much, much higher chance of landing on her. It is what it is. If you're going up against a boss that has sleep or something like that, maybe consider not using her. She is just sort of a lazy character, it seems, and that's why she's going to fall asleep. With regard to her append skills, it's an interesting one. Obviously, she has the normal loadout here. Her third one is anti-ruler attack damage aptitude. I'm not going to say there's too much synergy here, but you do have anti-good as one of her niches, of which a lot of the rulers are. So I guess you could use it, but it's ruler on ruler violence, and I'm not really sure you care to do that. You're probably just going to take an Avenger in most of those cases, particularly like Jalter or something, for instance. Her second append being the mana loading. Mana loading's always going to have its uses. Definitely still could be useful on her. However, I'm going to say you're probably going to get a little bit more usability maybe out of the fifth append, the skill reloading, because honestly, it really depends on the situations you're using her in. But I do think while the second append has its value, it's really going to get the most value out of like you trying to start her with like a 30% CE, or trying to like start her from 0 and have her kind of like wind up some charge over time or something. It's not going to be the easiest thing to get away with in most circumstances, and it will probably require some external help, but it depends. So I think the choice is yours here between the second or the fifth append as to which one to go for. I think the fifth append may be a little bit better if you want to focus a lot more on the cooldown reduction, doubling things up, or just getting back to them faster in a challenge environment. The choice is yours. I do think really you can't go wrong with probably any of the appends in this circumstance. The extra append would be really good in a challenge. The crit append would be really good in a challenge. So they all have some value. I think the third one is arguably the weakest. But I think at the end of the day, probably either mana loading or the fifth append is the one I would go with. Her actual Noble Phantasm here is going to be a 7-hit NP. It's AoE Buster, so we don't really care too much about it at that point. However, what is interesting here is that she's going to have 2 power modifier niches in play here, both a good alignment and evil alignment 50% power modifier that's really going to just kind of help out her damage, and she does kind of need it. So it is going to help set her apart here. The reason that this is interesting is because her damage is still pretty decent. She is going to probably beat the other 2 rulers outright in terms of damage output, and she's going to deal damage to all enemies, and she's going to recover the party's HP by 2,000. So this helps her work in conjunction with something like, say, Merlin, to just help keep the party alive and keep them topped off. I think that's something where, unless you were running like double Merlin before, it was difficult to maybe outpace a lot of fights. This is going to be one of those deals where, you know, maybe you can just make do now with just a single Merlin and her kind of rattling off NP after NP. This will also help offset trying to use someone like Koyanskaya, who drains HP with some of her skills in the party. So I think this is a really, really nice effect, and it is just going to overall add to her effective health and her tankability. And I think it is a just really awesome type of heal for her to have and utility for her to have. She's also from here going to charge the entire party's gauge by 10% after the fact. Another effect, interestingly enough, that Koyanskaya has. In this case, again, this is going to help her out potentially just getting back to another NP, but it's also going to help the supports get to an NP in one of their comps. So we do see a little bit of similarities with OG Tamamo as well here in this regard. She's in a weird way sort of like a kind of mixed up, different and offensive form of Tamamo. I don't think she's going to be as effective as a like support as Tamamo is, not even close. But you see a lot of similarities in the kit and things that it's like, hey, they realized that there was some synergy there to add all of these things into the same kit. So I definitely see it. I think, yes, you could also do something like add Castoria in, get some invincible comp going in there, and actually just have a whole lot of like capability to just take hits and keep the party up. So I think people looking at, you know, JonTron and saying like, hey, you know, I don't think she's that good, I think you're kind of missing the forest for the trees. She's definitely going to be a very effective and capable unit for a lot of people. She's just not going to be that unit that everybody's going to run out there and grab and say that they have to have. So from there, her NP is also going to have an overcharge effect. It's going to increase her own NP damage for 1 turn, activating first by a base of 20%. The scales all the way up to a whopping 40% at 500% overcharge. Definitely not something you'll see too often, but hey, you never know with things like the Invincible comp, or who knows, maybe you're using a Koyanskaya of Darkness alongside of her and actually giving her the overcharge effect. Maybe an Oberon as well to be able to take advantage of this. But looking at that 40% NP damage up and considering what if you could Oberon boost that, holy crap, that's 80% at that point. You can get a lot more firepower out of something like that. With regards to craft essences, obviously, I think something like Black Grail is going to be a very, obvious choice if you're doing something like a multiple damage dealer setup, or maybe something like a CQ where you're going to want the most firepower as always. But for a conventional farming setup, right now, it's looking like the answer is going to be cranking. She does need to start with a 50% C otherwise. And that is where you're going to see, as we go through the damage numbers here, maybe some of that kind of shining through as to this is why maybe some people don't regard her as being that strong, is because she is predominantly going to be factored in as using a 50% C. It doesn't mean you can't stretch it, doesn't mean you can't start her from zero if you set up the composition right, just depending on what you're trying to do. With that in mind, let's actually take a look at that specific charging scenario. On screen, you guys can see it now. We have the 3-turn scenario of what you would do if you just put her in a conventional 3-turn farming setup with her as the devoted damage dealer. You've got double Koyanskaya and Oberon as your supports. We don't bother with the mana loading append. We start her out with a 50% C. Again, no judgment as to which one you use, but obviously something like cranking would be best. And then we're going to go ahead and pop her own 50% charge on turn 1 so that we can get back to it for turn 3. From there, you're going to go ahead and obviously put up things like the Buster buffs from the Koyanskaya, maybe the man attribute niches from them as well, and you're going to fire off the first NP. That will actually get you 10% on the back of her NP, as well as 5% from her passive. So she will get just a base 15% right there off the bat for nothing. So it is what it is. Unfortunately, you can't really do too much with that. It's one of this, like, I've talked about it before, but it's kind of a block 50 charge issue is what I like to mention it as. It's the idea that Koyanskaya has 50% charge. She can't break it up in any way. Obviously, Jeanne Metatron's going to have 50% charge. She can't really break up in any way. Oberon has 50% charge and 20% charge, so you might be able to do something with the 20%, but not really here, not in this case. We did look at an application where, hey, maybe you can get Oberon to have cooldown reduction so that he gets back to his, like with the 5th append, so that he gets back to his first skill in time in order to potentially be able to double up his first skill. But you can't do anything with that either. So interestingly enough, the devs have designed this to be kind of foolproof and you can't tamper with it too much. But it is what it is. So anyways, she's going to have the 50% on the back of that NP. We're going to go ahead and pop both the Koyanskaya 50% charge skills at this point. That'll bring her up to full. That'll actually put her over full. And then we're just going to go ahead and use the Oberon 20% here as we rotate in turn 2 with the plug suit. And that will, go ahead and put her way over the 100% amount that she needs. But we can get away with it. So we just go ahead and fire off the NP the second time. She's going to refund the 15% yet again. It's not really refund, it's just charge per turn that she's getting. And then we're going to go ahead and use Oberon's 50% charge as well as Jeanne Metatron's 50% again as she's gotten back to that. And you should be more than capable of firing off the third NP and ending the node that way. So that's going to be how her charge scenario works. Now let's look at her raw damage output. As you guys can see on screen, this is Jeanne Metatron's sort of just raw numbers. These are completely neutral, no class effectiveness, and also no external buffs. This is just Jeanne Metatron with her own steroids under her own power in her own niches. Nothing coming from a Mystic Code, a Craft Essence, or a support unit. So looking at this with just pure neutral numbers in a vacuum, you guys can see up to NP5, she's definitely going to scale pretty nicely there, but realistically, there's nothing too much to write home about these numbers. Where they're going to start getting a lot better is when we start looking at the niche numbers. good or evil damage numbers is definitely going to be a lot better, as you've got that 50% power mod. It's going to also flow into her carding after the NP, so definitely an interesting thing there. But you can also have the potential to double up those 2 power mods and get good plus evil. You're not going to see that happen too often, but there are some interesting ways that you could maybe go about it, like conferring the evil trait onto somebody, or for instance, just having somebody like, say, Arjuna Alter that actually has both good and evil as their traits, which is really weird, but it is the way he works. So it's not going to be something you'll encounter super often, but hey, if you did have the opportunity, yeah, she could do even more crazy damage numbers. And then from there, let's go ahead and look at her actual damage in a traditional 3-turn composition. Now, like I said, obviously this doesn't reflect things like, you know, a multiple damage dealer setup. That's really hard to model stuff like that. So we just try to look at this and let you guys decide as to when and where and how to use them. But in this sort of setup, you guys can see waves 1 and 2 not going to be doing too hot here. This is a double Koyan Oberon with level 100 cranking and a maxed out Neo plug suit. So these are still neutral numbers, but now they start to include things like the craft essence and the mystic code and stuff like that. So waves 1 and 2 are going to be your like hairy waves. You're going to be really worried about the damage there. But wave 3, you're going to get the Oberon 3rd skill coming in, the mystic code coming in, and you're going to pop off. You're going to do a lot more damage right there from that. And this is actually really similar to a lot of other ruler numbers at the moment. She does, however, have the capacity to be at a power mod standpoint. And I think this is where you're really going to use her the most. So in this regard, I think this shores up the numbers quite a bit better. We definitely see at least some decent capability on turn 3 there, but even like turn 2, for instance, is going to be a lot more capable, especially if you manage to be effective. But even neutral 126k is going to do a lot, and you should be able to mop up quite a few nodes with something like that. The double power mods, certainly possible, and the reason we have to kind of at least include something like this is because you do also have things like the man attribute that Koyanskaya can provide. So you could have something where it's like, oh, it's both man and good, and then you would have the capability to kind of double up on some of this, and you guys can see the damage numbers are going to get a lot better as you start scaling up the sort of additional power modifiers there, even though they will just be additive with each other. The numbers on the bottom down here, just as a quick look, are your NP2 numbers. Obviously, things get better. I mean, nothing too much to say about that. So if you start getting additional MP levels of her, it's definitely going to shore her up quite a bit more. You're going to have more higher punching power, so to speak, and be able to handle more robust nodes as you do that. Now let's see how she stacks up against the competition. Well, obviously the elephant in the room is going to be Ruler Artoria. She is definitely going to be somebody that you will see a lot of comparisons to. She's also going to be an AoE buster unit. She has had a recent buff that has given her a little bit of supportive capacity as well. And you can see, again, wave 3 numbers at NP1 are pretty much exactly the same. Jontron had about 226k, Ruler Artoria coming in at 222k, so nothing too much different there. Jontron with a slight edge. The difference here is going to be that Ruler Artoria doesn't have damage niches, really. She does get the man niche from Koyanskaya, but again, not much that we can actually get away with there. So nothing really that changes things too much. I am going to say at the end of the day, this is probably one of the reasons why even after Ruler Artoria's buff, I think I can make a decent case for Ruler Artoria still getting another upgrade. It doesn't have to be something crazy, but I would like to see them maybe tweak either one of the skills or give her an NP interlude. But I digress. I just think it would pretty much help her out, and you'll see why I'm making that case here in a minute. So next up here we have Amakusa. Amakusa is another interesting one because he is somebody that I think every other ruler needs to beat. And the reason why is because Amakusa has a niche that is just extremely strong. He has buff removal, all buff removal before damage on his NP. So that is always going to be a very effective niche to have. It's always going to be a really solid thing for him to
kind of be able to plant his flag and say, I can do this. On top of that, he's a ruler, so he's super tanky. He does have some decent challenge applicability with his kit due to him getting 20% charge per turn. The problem is going to be that we do have other units out there at this point in time, like Abigail, who basically her summer form also has like the ability to buff strip and defensive buff remove. So it's definitely one of the reasons why they buffed Amakusa. But to me, Amakusa probably should actually be your lowest AoE damage ruler because of how effective his kit actually can be for certain content like that. That niche is always going to be in demand. So Amakusa already being at a point where he can rival some of them is actually pretty crazy. You can start him out with a 60% CE, but imagine if he could, say, touch a 50%, or even worse, somehow start from Black Grail capacity. Amakusa's damage numbers would really begin to spike up. I'm not saying they need to do that with him. I'm more saying it like Amakusa's already this competitive with the other rulers, even after their buffs, because they already pre-buffed him quite a bit. So to me, they actually do need to kind of give the other rulers some love, and then they can think about doing something else to fix the clunkiness that Amakusa has. Next up here, we actually have Moriarty Ruler. He is an arts one, obviously, but it is interesting to say the least, as Moriarty Ruler does have the evil and good niche, so he is somebody that you will want to compare to. Moriarty Ruler just got a really strong super buff, so you can see here on screen, he literally has just 420k damage right off the rip. This was a buff in response to, I believe, the devs sitting there thinking, well, one, he needs to be a little bit more impactful because he probably will be involved in the story, but two, I think a lot of people were writing Moriarty Ruler off. The devs didn't like that that was the thing, so they tried to give him a lot more firepower to make it justified. And I do think that's a good choice on their part, because there is another really strong ruler out there, still arguably the strongest ruler, and that's why I think it's a-okay to have Ruler Moriarty at this point. But this begs to differ then what's going on with the Buster AoE rulers, that we've kept them all so low in comparison now to our arts and quick AoE rulers. So in that regard, yes, the Buster rulers, I believe, do actually need a little bit more firepower in comparison. Johanna here is coming out, and she's definitely one that she's recently come out here on NA. And looking at her, she's also AoE arts, but she's also going to be anti-evil. She's also going to have supportive capabilities. So another overlap there. It's not just a raw damage output one. You guys can see she's going to come in still higher than the other two at 229k to their 226 and 222. So at that point, looking at this, we can see, one, you have a little bit more carrying capacity as a sort of third support in a composition, but two, even just as an effective damage dealer, she is actually going to beat some of them for raw damage output. So I do think Johanna already being this strong is another reason that, yes, the Buster units do need to be, because Johanna as an arts ruler is loopable and capable of just kind of sitting there and spamming out her damage. But again, we have another one here, and that's going to be Karen. Now, Karen has the anti-chaotic niche, and Karen is just ridiculously strong for stuff. This is one of the reasons why I've said for a long time that she just really has a lot of capability. People write Karen off, I think, but she has always been one of the strongest rulers in the game, and that is why they had to buff Moriarty as much as they did to some degree. So looking at that, and then looking back at our Buster rulers, we start to go, what are the devs doing, and why are they doing this? I get that the Buster rulers do have some additional capability, like for instance Buntoria having the card shuffle, Amakusa having the AoE buff strip, and now Jontron having the cooldown reduction. But each one of these other rulers also has tricks up their sleeves and reasons to be used, so I don't really see the point in what they're doing here at this point. It feels like the Buster rulers just have kind of gotten the short end of the stick. They definitely need to go back through and hit them with some actual upgrades that would amplify their damage a little bit more. And I think at that point we would be good. So looking back at like Jontron's numbers here now after everything, Like, is this a problem for her that she's only dealing about 226k without a power mod? No, I don't think so entirely. She does have the power mods in her kit and the capability to scale them up quite a bit higher. But I do think that, yeah, it's like if you already have a robust AoE ruler, you don't necessarily need her. This is really going to come down to how much you value that, you know, sort of multiple damage dealer setup or challenge application use for her. So don't blame people for thinking that she's not someone that they need to have. I don't blame people for thinking either that she's strong. I'm just going to say at the end of the day, the choice is yours as to whether or not you want to get her. So how do you guys feel about JonTron? Which ascension of hers is your favorite? And will you be rolling, or did you already roll for her? And how lucky were you? Be curious to hear you guys' thoughts, and I will see you guys for the next review. Hey, if you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe, right?